And so this just is a graphic that illustrates the greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector as I move into a larger discussion about agriculture. And so I think a lot of people have this conception, and it's true, that agriculture contributes a lot to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see it does contribute a significant amount, 9% overall. But there are ways, if we change our mindset about agriculture, that we could potentially sequester carbon and, basically mitigate the negative consequences we are creating by having agriculture and start implementing positive ones. So as I've addressed, agriculture affects climate change, but is also drastically affected by climate change in and of itself. And so we're seeing with increased temperatures, more extreme and frequent weather events that we're not prepared to deal with, we're seeing a reduction of food security. Not necessarily right here, because as Grace addressed, we have a certain amount of privilege. A lot of people in the United States, not everyone has that privilege as well. But we see in places such as rural Africa, where they're in, places close to the equator, they're more sensitive to climatic changes, and people are starving because of this. And so land development is a large issue. We're losing some of our, crucial carbon sinks, cutting down forests, developing grasslands, all of that's really bad. Monocultures, does anyone know what a monoculture is? There's plenty of them in the Midwest. Basically, for those of you who don't know, a monoculture is a large portion of land that's dedicated to developing and harvesting a single type of crop, and generally they do this year after year. But as I talked about natural ecosystems, the way that the earth is, meant to deal with things, a singular crop is not healthy, and it throws everything off of balance. So a lot of the time, farmers who do have the monocultures are having to supplement with artificial fertilizers, a lot of tillage, which is bad for the soil, and they, totally take away any possibility for, native species to exist or coexist with this cropping. Livestock, as you can see, my lovely cow picture at the bottom, is a big issue. Also, the United States has a tendency, a lot of us are heavy meat eaters and consume a large portion of that, so livestock cultivation is very prevalent. But livestock, as many of you have maybe heard, climate change is being caused by cow farts or cow burps. And so cows, along with, I think, goats and sheep are ruminants. So with their natural digestive processes, they emit methane, which is a greenhouse gas and has climate change potential when emitted in a large amount. And so managing and limiting our amount of ruminant cultivation, or doing it in a different manner, is really important moving forward. Manure management is really important as well. A lot of the time we see these big farms that have liquid manure pits, from their cattle. They have nowhere else to put it, and that just becomes a breeding ground for methane emission, and it's really not healthy for surrounding people or ecosystems. And then, especially with monocultures, we're seeing widespread soil degradation. So with the implementation of a lot of those artificial fertilizers, there's soil leaching. All of those fertilizers can get down into the groundwater. With the singular crop being farmed, there's the uptake of certain nutrients, and it tends to kill a lot of those healthy microbes that create that soil ecosystem that we need to have a productive system. With the monocultures, we also see heavy use of tillage, machinery going over the soil, which creates soil compaction. And so the soil does not have as high level of water retention capabilities nor aeration, which is really important for agricultural yields, healthy agricultural yields. And so as I've talked about, the way that I see this, I was inspired by a book I read a couple of years ago that's called Cows Save the Planet, but it's really more of a larger discussion on soil health and soil management. And so what I think about with our agriculture, we really need to be mindful about managing the soil in the future. If you're farming a crop or a series of crops preferably, you also soil. And so soil, like most things in the world, is primarily made up of organic components like carbon. And it naturally takes in carbon dioxide as it's processed. So when you have plant life on the soil, it goes underneath cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And the sugars that are used in the plant stay there, but the excess goes down into the root system and feeds the microbes in the soil. And those microbes play a key role in transforming that carbon into a stable form, and then that stays in the soil. And this is called carbon sequestration. So when you have a productive landscape, healthy plants, healthy soil, you're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which, although it's not the only answer for remedying climate change, it's a piece of it, and it could be really helpful. And so just some topics that are really important for soil health management are the proper application of fertilizers. So preferably staying away from synthetic fertilizers, go more towards compost or manure management, but make sure you do soil testing and see what the soil actually needs, so you're applying in the correct amounts. This is a really interesting piece. I just finished a summer internship working with conservation and agriculture out in Washington State this last summer, and I was actually able to see one of these facilities implemented. But it's basically an anaerobic containment for cow manure. And so what happens is they seal it off, and as the cow manure goes under the anaerobic process of decomposition, they harvest the methane, and the methane can be used as a source of energy. And so instead of emitting it back out into the atmosphere, it's more of a renewable source of energy rather than using fossil fuels.
So we have a number of those systems here in Wisconsin.
We do.
I have personally seen them, yes.
Wow.
In northeast Wisconsin, we have a number of those.
That's very exciting to hear. I know they're pretty costly to implement, but a lot of the time what people do is farmers will create kind of like a coalition or an agreement to fund one of these facilities to being implemented. I think there is a dairy farm over in Wyega that actually uses one. I'm forgetting the name right now, but they're
It's probably Quantum, but
Quantum Dairy?
Yeah, but there's more. There's one in Greenleaf, there's one in Pulaski. Those are the ones I can just off the top of my head.
So Wisconsin, a lot of people in Wisconsin are moving forward with some of these efforts because we're an agricultural-based state. I mean, we're part of the Midwest. Agriculture is basically our foundation, and so this is why I think agriculture is a huge point to address when trying to reach out to community members about climate changes, because it's a point where people can come together. I actually saw one of those manure containment facilities, a really small scale one, when I was on a local farm in Costa Rica. They had one dairy cow, and they had a tiny, tiny aerobic digester. It was the coolest thing ever. I think the cow's name was Chocolate, but yeah, she had her own special facility. Okay, so another piece of that is also improving pasture prevalence and maintenance. So instead of developing these farms that are, garnered towards like producing large amounts of cattle or dairy, have a smaller livestock capacity, but invest more in pasture land, because grasslands are crucial for sequestering carbon. And a way that you can do this also is you don't have to bring in your feed for a lot of the cattle. If you implement a rotational grazing plan, that's really helpful. So the cattle will actually, if you keep them in field A for a day, they will eat the grass down to a certain level, but then you move them. The key to rotational grazing is you let the cows eat the grass down to its optimal growth height, I think. And so the grass will undergo the photosynthesis and sequester more carbon because it's growing at that faster rate. And then, like I said, soil farming is really important. So avoiding that compaction, maintaining soil health overall, catering more towards the microbes, and focusing on putting in that healthy organic matter and helping the soil that way. So soil, like I talked about a little bit with the ocean before, soil is also a carbon sink. So it takes in 1.5 to 5.5 billion tons of carbon a year globally. it's still only a fraction of, global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's a huge part. And if we really invest in it, it's a key player in, mitigating the negative consequences of climate change in the future. And so healthy soils, we've kind of already gone over that. So. And then a really interesting concept that I've been reading more about lately, there's a fantastic documentary out there that my family and I just watched. It's called The Biggest Little Farm, but it's focused on, it's kind of like a combined concept of biodynamic agriculture and holistic management. And so it's more of an idea. This is why I did that ecosystem review. It's looking at your agricultural system as a living, breathing organism, modeling it after the complexity of ecosystems and trying to put your agricultural system in the natural environment and foster relationships with native species. So by having this system in place, you're not harming the wildlife, as much as you would in a traditional sense. So biodynamic agriculture overall is organic agriculture with that larger ecosystem component. And it integrates more variables and interactions between species on your farm that you're trying to cultivate and also the wildlife. And so with that documentary I just mentioned, it's focused on a farm that's called Habitat Lane Farms, and this is, I don't know, maybe like 100 miles outside of Los Angeles in California. So it's in a very traditionally urban setting. But it's a 200-acre farm, and they implemented this biodynamic agriculture. And you can see in this picture, just simply the crops that are used. There's so many different kinds. But a really interesting piece that they talked about is, so they were having a gopher issue in their orchard, but the gophers were really crucial for, breaking up the soil and aerating it to have healthier yields from their trees. But the gopher population was so out of hand that they were killing the trees. So what did they do? They put in owl boxes, and they had barn owls coming in that would feed on the gophers. And so it's looking at, okay, so you have a quote-unquote pest in your system. How can it benefit you, and what potential natural methods can you implement to, control it, remediate it? And I like this quote. It says, biodynamic, this is from one of the co-founders of this farm, but it's biodynamic agriculture treats the farm like a living organism, self-contained and self-sustainable. There's just that extra piece of managing it in a way that benefits us as well.
So